Welcome to Goldfish on Games and the month of DOScember, a time when various YouTubers come together to celebrate that most classic of command line operating systems. And today I want to check out the original 3DFX. So let's practice some Voodoo on DOS. Here we have a selection of games that could use 3D accelerator cards, but only under DOS. And while this was popular in the early days of the Voodoo cards, it was far more likely that you'd see 3D support in Windows games after a few years. Because of that early nature, these games did have a few oddities. So let's see what the Voodoo One could do with these games. And in no real order, we start with Archimedean Dynasty. This is a game about travelling under the sea due to the surface being wrecked by mankind's hands. You have to go about taking missions, upgrading your ship, and then taking part in an epic storyline. And you travel around this huge world, finding different outposts and then chatting with various people who all help try and move that story along. And when you're cruising around in your submarine, the view distance isn't all that great. But that does sort of make sense at the depths we're talking about here. And thankfully we aren't just limited to torpedoes, as you do get a whole range of weapons at your disposal. There's also variety in the various vessels that you get to outfit across the game. It's a title that I've been meaning to replay at some point, and then probably do a review on it. And then possibly checking out the later series that was based on this game called Aquanox. As this game was released in 1996, it was just before the Voodoo cards really started to take off. So as you can imagine, it didn't come with support for the accelerator in the box. It had to get a glide patch later. Now I should point out that I will use a number of terms interchangeably through this video. Those will include 3DFX, Voodoo and Glide. As 3DFX was the company, Voodoo was the name of the graphics chip, and Glide was the library that was designed specifically for this hardware. Now these days we tend to think about more general libraries such as Direct3D, OpenGL and Vulkan. But back then, just about every single graphics chip had its own library that was used to give you direct access to the hardware. But these patches tended to chop and change what they called themselves using all those various terms. You got 3DFX patches, Glide patches, Voodoo patches. It was a whole mix of them, so I will mix it up myself as well. Now getting these patches was always welcome, even if they weren't always a perfect upgrade, as the games were designed around the software rendering, and then were typically quickly updated to support the new hardware. And as we've seen so far, this game does look and play great on the Voodoo card, but it also looks pretty decent if slower in software mode. But there is something you might not have realised, and that in the software mode those weapons actually have a much better looking impact when they collide with the other craft. I don't know if those little dings got lost inside of the models, or if they just weren't added at all, but it does look so much nicer. And the software mode also has the whole view shaking when you get hit. Now there does seem to be an option for it in the 3DFX edition, but it just does not seem to work when it's enabled. Now when I play this game I'll still pick the Glide version over software, if just for that improved frame rate, and to be honest the filtering doesn't actually look too bad on this game. But it is interesting to see that not all the games will be an automatic win for the 3D hardware. And after being under the sea, where else can we go but on land with cars with Carmageddon? A game that I'm sure needs no introduction, but you're gonna get one anyway. The official story is that solar flares have turned most of mankind into zombies. And in this time of peace, we had nothing to beat back the horde. That was apart from cars. So select racers built their own death wagons and go out to clear the streets of those zombies. Now this is obviously a load of crap, as those zombies with the green blood was only added when they couldn't get the game initially released. And if it really was all about taking out the zombies, why can you win a race by hitting all the checkpoints, or by taking out all the other cars? Now it is true that you will get more time from mowing them down, which can be very useful on some of the races where smashing up the other cars can be quite tricky. Now this was another game that got a patch with glide support, but that patch was also released both online and via the expansion the Splat Pack, which really would have helped get this out to more gamers. One thing you can come to expect from these glide versions is that the number of graphics options will be reduced, with the choice of resolution quite often being removed entirely, with most developers picking on the higher of the resolution modes that the game supported, typically around 640 by 480, and this is what Carmageddon does, but the patch also provided a bunch of higher resolution textures, and these really shine in that mode. With the text looking nice and crisp, and that image of the car, it just looks awesome. So the game does look absolutely great, but the frame rate can take a bit of a hit. But I will say you do get used to it after a little bit. But in DOS software mode you can see it running a little bit smoother on the hardware, but that is to be expected seeing it is running at half the resolution. And the hardware is a 200MHz Pentium, by the way. There was also a Windows 95 EXE, which did have support for the high resolution mode, but you were still using software drawing, even if it was using DirectX for displaying the image on the screen, as well as handling audio. Now getting this game to run can be a little bit fiddly, as it doesn't like the most recent version of the Glide drivers. Now while this isn't using the Windows drivers, it is using a DOS library called Glide 2X OVL, which needs to be in the system path or at least put it in the game directory. Now some games would rely on having that file in the patch itself, rather than asking you to install Windows drivers to get that version. But there are some games that will just happily use whatever one you happen to have, which could be quite good, as the newer releases also supported the newer cards. So you could try playing this on a Voodoo 2 for example, though there was an updated patch just for that card. But there were some games that were far more limited, as they statically were linked against the library, so it was all contained in the executable, which would typically mean it was limited to just running on the Voodoo 1, but every so often it might also work on a Voodoo Rush. So let's now go into outer space with Descent 2, the follow-up to that acclaimed game. This is bigger and more complex than ever before. You now have hostages to rescue and keys to find, though there are now guide bots that will also help you get around if you get lost. On top of that, there's also a dynamic lighting system which does make the game look pretty amazing. It's still that full 6 degrees of first person movement, which is either amazing or will completely mess with your head. This is our third game that was also patched after the fact, but some of the later releases included those 3D modes in the box. But if you weren't that lucky, then trying to find those patches wasn't always that easy. As for the ones required for Descent 2 when combined were a good 1.5 megabytes in size, which might just take mere seconds these days, but back then it could take 4+ minutes on a 56k modem, or double that on a 28.8 modem that I had back then. Other patches also got bigger, so one of the best ways to get these updates was actually from cover discs from the various magazines, and they tended to have a nice collection on each disc. Descent 2 actually shows up a common problem with a lot of these 3D patches, and that is with smaller textures that get scaled up with filtering applied. They end up looking a little bad as those defined edges can just get blurred away, and this tends to be worse on textures with alpha, and more so when they're used for small particle effects, as you'd sometimes get these horrible nasty scale textures that the software mode would do something clever with, but they couldn't do that natively on the 3D hardware. That tended to be one of the trade-offs that you had to decide on. You've got higher resolutions with typically better frame rates, but then you could also get some horrible looking textures. But to be honest, back then the filtered textures was almost seen as a pride point, as it meant that you had a 3D card that could filter those textures. They weren't all blocky like in the software mode, or even on those consoles that were out at the time. They were properly perspective corrected and everything. It's funny now that I've gotten older that I've actually come back around to liking that look of those blocky textures. And will tend to switch to nearest neighbour filtering rather than linear or bilinear filtering that was popular at the time, but only if the games have that option. Most of these don't. To see that here we have to drop down to the software mode, which I do think looks quite good. I think it also might handle the lighting a little better, as the enemy ships feel more a part of the world, where I felt that they really popped a little too much back in the accelerated mode. I'd be hard pushed to pick which version I think is best, as I do like the look of the software game. But that additional frame rate of the accelerated version is very nice, so I do think it's mostly down to the hardware resources you have to hand. And it's time to get out on foot and check out some tombs in everyone's favourite game, Tomb Raider. Which is another game that doesn't really need much introduction. But if I didn't say anything, then this would be a much shorter video, and the YouTube algorithm demands longer videos. So this is the very first adventure of Lara Croft, and it was far back enough in time that it actually launched on DOS, which is obviously a far cry away from the latest game which launched on Windows 10. In this you have to go around exploring these vast underground worlds and basically steal anything that's not nailed down. And if it is nailed down, then go get that pry bar and get it up. There's also this side business of making sure that the animals that we thought were extinct already stay that way, with bullets. It revolutionised the third-person adventure game in a way that Fade to Black never quite managed. And due to how massively popular this game was at the time, it got quite a few 3D patches, not just for the Voodoo, but for each major card that was around at the time. Now Tomb Raider initially supported 3 different detail levels, and a low and high resolution mode. And as we can see in the software version, high resolution mode does really require quite the machine to run smoothly. It looks great and all, but the frame rate is really quite bad. But the low resolution mode still does look quite good and would have been similar to what the consoles would have been doing at the time. But going back to the Glide version, we can see it running in a glorious 640 by 480 and running it very nicely. It still does have a few options, as you can switch between what it calls normal texture mapping. That is just regular textures, not normal map textures, that would still be a few years out. And also MIP map mode, which is a way of trying to make those further away areas look a little better by using smaller textures. This helps avoid noisy looking textures that change a bit too much from a distance. But this can look a little broken in the game, as it starts to show up lines between some of the geometry in the world, which tend to go away if you go back to the normal texture mapping. There's also this other weird little bug, and it happens when you fire, as you get these weird little outlines around the muzzle flashes. It's not game breaking or anything, and I think it is pretty obvious to say that between the Glide and the software mode, the Glide mode wins out. The whole world does look pretty good, and I think they did a great job with the texture mapping. The filtering just seems to actually work really well with it. And we are returning to driving again with Gremlin graphics, Fatal Racing. A game about driving fast around crazy tracks that would make Wipeout look normal. The default starting track has 2 massive loops, and on top of everything else you also have to deal with damage as well. This is Fatal Racing after all. And you can also damage the other cars as well. Hit them enough and they, or possibly you, will explode, or you can hit the pits to try and fix yourself up. But with the races being so fast, stopping will really drop you down the pack, so it's not something you really want to do. And this wasn't Gremlin's first 3D game as well, as they've been making the Actua sports games for a little while now, which even got a bit of a plug in the billboards in the game. They'd also made Slipstream 5000, which was a great little racer, but was purely software. This is actually one of the harder Voodoo games to get your hands on, as this edition was only made to be bundled with graphics cards. And if you're looking for this overseas, you might find it under its American name, Whiplash. Now, producing these OEM or original equipment manufacturer releases was actually quite popular, as quite often these were older games that making a patch for really wouldn't have resulted in much extra sales. So instead, these OEMs would find a bunch of developers and ask them to update some of their older games that they could include with their cards, and would normally stock 3 to 5 games from various different publishers. And that would be quite cool, as you'd get a bunch of games you could use straight away with your card, because it was quite possible that you wouldn't have anything in your collection that would really make use of it. But one of the downsides of this is they really didn't have to worry about the quality of the product, as it was never going to be sold alone, as it was already a 2 to 3 year old game by this point, and sometimes this showed, and Fatal Racing is one of those releases. As here's the software version, and while the frame rate isn't great, in many ways it looks far better. You get all these great bits of the HUD, and all the text looks a lot cleaner, and I think the pixelated textures actually suit the look of this game far more than those filtered ones. Plus the fact that on the Glide Edition, it keeps switching the 3D card on and off whenever you're going back in and out of the menus. It's a little bit annoying, and the software mode is even running in SVGA, which could actually be run at a higher resolution than the 3DFX edition, though it is hard to tell, as it runs at some very weird resolution that the OSSC and capture card did not want to lock onto. So in the end, I had to use some of the environment variables to force the 3DFX card to run at 640 by 480, which is why some of the HUD does get cut off. But even without that, you still wouldn't have got all the extras that was around the screen in the original. And it seems we're back to flying around, but this time in a helicopter, as we're going to be extremely assaulting in Extreme Assault. Now this is the only game we've played that actually had 3DFX support in the box, but this was also a game that would utilise MMX technology as well as Pentium 2s, which isn't a surprise in 1997, but what might be surprising is it still ran on DOS, as by this point many games had started to become Windows only. More so if they're actually pushing the new hardware. In game, you're in charge of the most advanced helicopter that isn't named Airwolf. You have multiple missions to take part in, all of which will get laid out via this in-game cutscene that will let you know what you need to do. To start off with, it's very basic, take out the targets, but like in Descent previously, you do end up having to save hostages as well as take out buildings and other things along the way. Unlike most of the other games, the glide mode isn't quite as dramatic a change as we've seen previously, with the textures getting that almost trademark filtering and the frame rate becoming buttery smooth, but most of the in-game effects are there in all modes. Well, as long as you have the CPU power to push it, obviously. If the high resolution modes weren't too much, then you can actually even drop it down to quite a low resolution, and the game runs pretty nicely. Which, as you might expect, are actually exclusive to the software modes, as hardware acceleration is high resolution all the time. Now this game is much closer to what we would come to expect from other games in the last few years of the 90s, with them coming out with the accelerated and software modes in the box. Sometimes it would be separate exes, but increasingly they would actually be able to handle both inside the same game, and some of them would try and make the game look almost identical across each version, but other times you'd find them trying to add extra things into the 3DFX mode and make it look much fancier. But by 1997 we really were looking at the end of 3D accelerated games coming out for the command line OS. And with that, I hope you enjoyed that look at various DOS games that were using that most iconic of graphics card. It was such an interesting time in PC gaming, as each year new hardware was showing up, and keeping up could be quite difficult. But that original Voodoo card really did punch above its weight, and kept me going at least for quite a while. And so until next time, I was the Goldfish. That was the voodoo that you do, people, and this was Goldfish on Games.
Mission successful.
Thank you for watching my video. I do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, you can let me know down in the comments, or you can use those buttons just below. You know the ones I mean. Or if you're not sure yet, then you can check out 2 other videos that I've done that are on the screen right now. So thank you again, and I hope to see you soon.